Hello, everybody. Good morning. This is your host, Jordan Tremaine, and welcome to the Perspective Podcast, where we explore new thoughts, connect ideas, and offer perspectives that may change the way you think about a thing or two. And today, we're talking about logic fusing. All right, so I am in the process of building up to a really interesting idea that'll come later. But as part of that, I got to do some mise en place. That's, I think, a French word. Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. But it's this idea, like, on the Food Network or whatever cooking show, where the show is like trying to act like you can cook along with the cook, and they're like, okay, so we're gonna prepare this meal, and they have all of this stuff like cut and prepared like in little bowls, and they're like, oh, we're gonna add some of this and some of that, and you don't have time to keep up because you gotta chop and prepare all the stuff. But the mise en place is like all the little bowls with the pre-prepared ingredients. So one could have pepper in it, one could have diced chicken, one could have, I don't know, pineapples or whatever, and you're just grabbing from each bowl and you're not doing any of the prep. So right now we're doing the mise en place. We're preparing the little bowls, and we're gonna make a meal later. But right now we gotta prepare this one bowl that's called logic fusing. And I really like this concept. It's a spin-off from the Perspective podcast episode on logic aliasing. So if you haven't listened to that episode, I'd say go listen to that episode. I know that episode was part of a series where I was like the Emotion Machine and then some other episode I forgot the name of. But the series that turned into the Emotion Machine and went on is separate than what I'm going to talk about now, because I think logic fusing is a specific way that you can alias. And so we're going to get into that, but this is like one of however, I don't know how many ways there are to alias, but I think this to look at this in particular today, I think will be helpful for episodes later. So the basic idea of logic aliasing is if you're trying to explain something to somebody, you're trying to give them information, you're trying to give them data. And if you if you're telling them information, but it's too much information for them to intake right now, or it's too complex for them to intake as you're talking, so they get kind of lost in the sauce while you're explaining to them, they have a high risk of misunderstanding because they can't keep up with processing the information you're giving them. And you could help out in a bunch of different ways, like slowing down how fast you're giving the information, repeating it, asking them questions. You can do a bunch of stuff, but there's this idea that it's possible where you can fire hose somebody, which is a term that I learned in engineering, and it's basically like you give someone too much information, so it's kind of like they asked for a drink of water, and you're like, okay, and you turn on this fire hose and just shoot them with this fire hose of information, and they get like blasted, and then maybe no water gets into their mouth at all. They're still thirsty, but now their clothes are ripped, they got blasted down the street and all this kind of stuff. That kind of thing can happen where something gets lost in translation. And if you're interested in that concept, which I really hope you go listen to that podcast before you listen to this episode, because I think it helps a lot, go back and listen to logic aliasing. But today we're going to talk about something called logic fusing. And fusing, it's like stuff coming together. I'm not talking about like electrical fuses. I blew a fuse. No, I'm talking about fusing like in Dragon Ball Z, where they do the fusion dance and the two people come together to make one more powerful being. So, anyways, in terms of logic fusing, I think that there is a limit to the amount of separate thoughts that any person can hold in their head at one time. And this isn't to say that like my hard drive or like the whole brain of mine can only hold so many thoughts. I'm talking about actively thinking. Like when you think about like your kitchen can hold a lot of supplies and a lot of different foods, but your stove, the thing you're actively cooking on, it can only hold as many pots as you have burners. And some stoves have one burner, some stoves have four burners, some stoves have six burners. So it gives some people the freedom to cook more at once, but no matter how much food you have in your kitchen, you can only cook on your stove with as many pots and pans as you have burners. And that's what I mean, separate thoughts that a person can hold in their head at one time. How many thoughts can you juggle at once? Can you think about actively at the same time? And I think that number is different for everybody. There's a group of people that can think two thoughts at the same time. There's a group of people that can think 20 thoughts at the same time. But I don't think that all people are right now at this moment, we're all able to think five thoughts at the same time. And because the number is different for different people, as an example, when you're trying to talk to somebody and you're trying to explain something that involves 10 different elements that need to come together to make this explanation work, but the listener can only juggle 5 different elements at one time, then that may cause confusion. They may miss out or misinterpret it because they need 10 burners on their stove, but they only have 5. So it may become very difficult to cook a good meal or the meal they intended because they don't have enough capacity to do all the cooking at once. Unless they're like very skilled and they're like switching pans and turning the burners up and down like a DJ or something like that. But then like I would guess that if they're that skilled, they probably do have 10 burners. Anyways, I think one of the interesting forms of this confusion, because that's kind of a metaphor for logic aliasing, where there's confusion because you don't have enough burners to process all the pots. One of the interesting forms of this confusion is when you have 10 aspects, when you have 10 different things that you need to be able to juggle in order to understand this concept, and you're trying to explain it to somebody that can only juggle 5 things. And the listener, because the listener can only think about 5 separate things at once, they're only able to discern, they may only be able to discern 5 out of the 10 things you're talking about. And sometimes this is, I only heard 5 and I missed the other 5. But in the case of logic fusing, I think sometimes there can be subtleties in arguments where you really need to listen close and understand the difference between two things. And if you're running at this point where you're at your limit of the different things you can juggle at once, you might get confused and think that these things that are really 2 separate things, they're fused and they're one thing. And the guy that's trying to explain it to you is like, no, those are 2 separate things. But your mind can't, for whatever reason, separate those 2, and they're the same thing. And this can happen in a way that creates confusion because the person that's listening can't fully separate out all the stuff so that we can cook a good meal. So like if you had 10 different dishes that you were trying to cook and you only had 5 burners, and like somebody's like, yo, we need to cook 10 dishes. It would be like if you just poured some of the dishes into the same pot, like, oh, that's the same thing, right? No, that's not the same thing, because you're going to mix 2 dishes and they're going to be a not one dish or the other dish. It's going to be a mix of both dishes and not either one. And depending on how many concepts you're trying to explain to somebody, this might happen a lot, and you might end up with a lot of things mixed in the same pot that were never supposed to be mixed. And it can cause people to miss out on parts of the argument because they can't fully understand this situation, or to confuse parts of the argument where you're trying to say, look, there's 2 different coins here, and they're like, nah, these are 2 sides of the same coin, and you can even get caught up in that, where it turns into kind of this argument about like, I'm not stupid, I can see that there's a heads and a tails, and it's like, I'm not even talking about that. I'm saying there's 2 coins. And it could become this whole different discussion because a person doesn't have the ability to see that it's not one coin, it's two coins. And this can just lead people way off track with what was intended from who's trying to explain. And that kind of can be like when you're trying to turn the one coin, when the explainer understands, they're like, oh geez, I think this guy's misunderstanding, and he thinks there's only one coin when there's really two coins. Much like in some of the problems I listed out with logic aliasing, when the explainer's like, no dude, there's really two coins, the guy that's listening, he may think you're trying to pull a fast one or trick him, and he's like, I listened to you, and there's only one coin. You said there was one coin, and now you're saying there's two coins. And it's like, nope, that's wrong. And this can turn into this like Twilight Zone kind of thing that is like a bunch of craziness, because the listener, he can get confused, and this kind of goes back to what I was talking about with magic in the podcast I did about magic, where, like as an example, if I'm going to back up for a second. It can turn into an example that involves magic, because magic is about doing something. You know what happens, but you don't know why it happens. And so the listener may think he knows the result. Yeah, I know there's one coin, but he doesn't know how it works. He doesn't know the ins and outs. When he pops the hood, he doesn't know what's going on. He can see that it's a car, but when he pops the hood, he's like, oh, I don't know what this is. And when he pops, like when you really dig into it, it's two different coins. But because he's not digging into it, he's digging his heels in instead. He confuses magic for wizardry. Wizardry is when you really know what's going on, when you're the mechanic, when you know how the engine works. But he doesn't. He just knows that it's a car. And if you can get into this misunderstanding where people think magic is full understanding, but the whole idea of magic is that you don't understand. You just maybe can use it, but you're not even sure if you're using it right, because you're not the person who designed it and knows what's going on. So I think that's interesting. Another example of this that involves magic is when something is not exactly straightforward, or maybe like in magic, the wizard is the person who knows what's really going on, so to them it's not magic, and to everybody else it is magic because they don't know what's really going on. But sometimes, like in a certain setting, there's like two people, and neither one fully knows what's going on, but let's say like one person, I'm explaining it to him, he doesn't know anything. He knows 0% of what's going on. And I, who's doing the explaining, I know like 80% of what's going on. I don't fully know everything. So to me, it's 20% magic, 80% wizardry. And I'm trying to explain that to him. Like, this isn't the full explanation, because like 20% of this is kind of unknown to me. But that might be hard to translate. And so the person that I'm explaining it to, like you're playing a game of telephone and stuff gets lost, they might think that 80% is 100%. They might walk away from that conversation thinking they know everything there is to know about this thing, or everything they need to know, when in fact, like, part of what I explained to them is just how to do it and not why it works, or what you need to be aware of. The idea of logic fusing, I think, so far in this podcast, I've been talking about in general, where like you're explaining a concept, and because a person can't juggle enough concepts in their head to really understand what you're talking about or follow how you're explaining, then they get confused, and logic fusing is a particular way that they're getting confused. That's one example, which is like the general example, but then there's also like specific acute logic fusing, where even if a person can, like, you're trying to explain something that takes 10 ideas, and they can think 10 ideas at the same time, they can still logic fuse, I think, because logic fusing can happen with particular topics. So there's certain things where certain individuals cannot separate certain ideas into smaller ideas. And this could happen for whatever reasons, like their belief set, or they think they're a really hardcore idea holder that like this is this way, when you're like, I'm trying to show you a different way, or show you that this is really two things. And they're like, no, this is one coin. It's not two coins. Or maybe they have a previous misunderstanding from like a different conversation, or from some life experience that's making it difficult for you to get across what you're trying to explain. And I think a good example of this, I think sometimes people have some difficulty separating race and culture. There's this happened to me once, where I was talking to somebody, and during the conversation at the time, I guess it came out that I had a person that was like I was dating, and the person I was talking to, they were like asking me questions about the person I was dating, like, oh, like, where'd you meet this person? What's their name? Why do you like this person? And one of the questions was, what race are they? And I thought that was a really odd question. All the other questions I felt were like appropriate questions, where I don't know, the basic small talk questions. But the race question to me had like no business being in that conversation. Like, why do you need to know what race somebody is? And I didn't know. And because I didn't think it was important. And the person I was talking to was like, how could you not know what race they are? And I was like, because it's not important. And like, we got into this whole conversation about just that. And I think what was trying to be put across was that different cultures sometimes can clash because of their cultural beliefs, practices, rituals, that kind of thing. And you should be knowledgeable of the culture that the people you date subscribe to, so that you can like be respectful of it, you can know what you're getting into, and that kind of thing. And in my mind, I was like, okay, like after a while of talking about this and trying to see where this guy was going with this, I was like, okay, I think I see where you're coming from, but I still don't think that has anything to do with race, because just because you're a certain race does not mean that you have any cultural background in that race, especially in the United States. Like, you could be adopted and raised in a totally different culture. You could be in another country like the United States and be raised in a totally different culture. You could be like, just as an example, just because you're Native American does not necessarily mean that you know anything about Native Americans or that you're connected with your culture. I would say there's a reasonably higher chance than other people that are not Native American that you're connected with the Native American culture in particular. But like, you could be connected to any culture. I think the culture that you're connected to is a product of your environment and your upbringing, not a product of the color of your skin. Like just because you were born Chinese doesn't make you like culturally Chinese. It could mean that you were born into an environment that's culturally Chinese, and then that's true. But for me to say like, oh, let me get into a relationship with this person. Oh, look, they're this race. They're Native American or whatever. Let me treat them like they're culturally Native American. Like, to me, that's like, unless I have clear signals and signs, or they tell me that they're culturally Native American, I shouldn't treat them a way I don't know they are. And to me, I felt like that was a bit of logic fusing on the part of the person that was talking to me, because they were fusing this idea of, because your skin is this color, you follow these cultural practices. And it's like, no, culture and race are different. They're often intertwined, but they are different. And so So I thought that was an interesting one, because aside from that, in that conversation, we were having a good conversation, and I feel like we were understanding each other on most points, and there wasn't fusing there wasn't logic fusing because someone was explaining something that required so many concepts that the other person couldn't keep up. There was logic fusing because on one particular issue, somebody was having trouble separating one concept into two. That was my perspective on it, and that is, I think, a kind of a product of simplification when you look at it. If you want to listen to the podcast I did on simplification, where not necessarily that this person that was talking to me was doing simplification, but I think maybe what they were taught, or what they've seen in culture, or what they've seen in the media and stuff, has given them a simplified view of race and culture. And that's, I mean, I'm not going to hold stuff like that against people, but when it comes in my face, like when I'm having a conversation with it, I want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. I want to take a step back and say, like, yo, is this really, why are you saying that? I don't understand. And if it comes out that doesn't make sense, I'm going to say something. And that's what happened in this case. And that's fine. And it's something that does happen. And I hope that if that comes up in conversation in your life, that this kind of discourse is able to happen. It may be awkward, and people may get offended because they could be wrong, or they might be kind of forced to, on the spot, change their views or something like that, where I don't think you should force people to change views and stuff, but I also don't think you should like close your mouth and like agree with people just to protect their ego or to protect what they think is right, when it's plainly obvious to everybody that this is heading down a path where they're not correct, or they're saying something that's not matching up. And so I'd say, have tact, have manners, help people. Don't like condemn people and call them stupid and be like, how dare you say that race and culture are directly correlated? What a dumb person. Like, don't do that. But like, I think it's good to work together and communicate and really see what we both think is true, and work together, and not I'm right and not you're right, but let's work together and see what we can come up with. So it's kind of a careful tightrope to walk sometimes when you see stuff like logic fusing or simplification or logic aliasing, and you're trying to like tell other people, like, hey man, this kind of thing is happening. Which is one of the reasons I'm explaining these ideas in these podcasts, because I think when you have a clear, or the more clear your idea on it, the more clear your thought on it, then the easier it is for you to use that tool. And also, sometimes people don't listen to you because you're their husband or wife. People don't listen to you because you're their coworker or because you're their friend. They don't see you as somebody that can speak into their life that way. And sometimes this is something I use a lot at work, where people don't believe me because, I don't know, I'm new, or for whatever reason. I find someone that I know they believe, and I convince them because I can talk to them. They're not judging me or being whatever. And then the person that I talk to goes and talks to the original person, and then they're like, okay, cool. Where I get the point across, but not through me, because sometimes the message isn't getting across specifically because you're the one communicating it, not because the information is wrong. And so another reason why I do these podcasts is sometimes it helps to be like, hey man, I heard this really cool podcast. You should listen to it. We'll have a conversation about it. But it's really like, I've been trying to tell you this for like 6 years. I haven't really had the words, or you haven't been listening to me. But maybe when you hear it from this other person, that it'll click. Something will turn on in your head, and you'll be like, oh my gosh, that's a real thing. And then you'll be like, yeah, that's what you've been doing. And you're like, oh geez, I've been doing that? Something like that. So again, don't use these podcasts as reasons to be like, haha, you're dumb, you need to change. Like, don't do that, please. But I think these are cool little 20-30 minute kind of thought exercises that you guys can both be on the same page and talk about the same topic if you both listen to the same podcast. So it might help with communication. So this has kind of been the episode on logic fusing. It's a kind of different offshoot, or a more specific case of something I talked about a long time ago called logic aliasing. If you've listened to that podcast, I think that this is intertwined with the concepts of magic for the podcast that I did on magic and the podcast that I did on simplification. They're kind of intertwined, and it can help build a better understanding of what I'm talking about now if you go listen to those podcasts. But even if you don't, I gave a simplified kind of definition of each one of those podcasts inside of this podcast, which, going back to the simplification thing, is not the full picture. Because I only put a couple of sentences on the simplification in this podcast, it's not the full idea. So if you listen to the real at length podcast, you're going to get a totally different idea of what simplification is, even though they're similar. But I did take the 5 thing and turn it into a 1 thing if you go and listen to that podcast. And I did that on purpose to move this conversation along, because I can't make this like a 7-hour podcast to explain everything. But I'm giving you that breadcrumb to go back in case you're ever interested. I'm giving you access to the full content by giving you that reference. So please use that reference if you haven't listened to that episode. But how's that for a tie-in? Oh, man, going full circle all day. Anyways, this has been the Perspective Podcast episode on logic fusing. And whatever kind of day that you're having, I hope that it's real. I hope that these podcasts help you to live in reality, to experience reality, to accept reality, and to love living in reality. Like fantastic stuff like Santa Claus and The Matrix and all that kind of stuff is super interesting. It's super fun. But reality is interesting enough with all the crazy stuff that happens in reality. So I hope that these podcasts help give you tools to live and navigate in reality. And I hope that as far as this logic fusing concept is concerned, it's not too complicated. I think you can understand it. I think everybody can understand it. And if you have to listen to this episode more than once, if you're interested to understand it, that doesn't make you dumb. That makes you persistent. That makes you committed. That makes you careful. Those are good things. And I hope that this concept of logic fusing at some point turns into a good conversation for you somewhere down the road. Anyways, I'll talk to you guys later. Have a good one.